Hey guys, welcome back to another video. In this video, I'm going to be talking about hanging pawns in chess. So, hanging pawns, sometimes they could be advantageous, sometimes they could be a weakness. And it really depends on how you play the board and how you just proceed. And also depends on the position. So, I'm going to be talking about hanging pawns later. So, let's get started. Okay, so hanging pawns are are a type of isolated pawn couple. So it involves two pawns that are isolated from the rest of the pawns. So in this case, white has their pawns on c4 and d4, and they're isolated from the other pawns. Notice that there's no pawns on the b file, there's no pawns on the e file, so there's no pawns that could really defend the c pawn and the d pawn from the b file and the e file. So for white, these isolated pawn couples might be, well, most likely will be on c4 and d4. For black, it might, depending on the opening that is played out, might be on c5 and d5 or c6 and d6. Really depends. c5 and d5 might be a result of the Sicilian. Here, this for white, these two pawns could be the result of any opening. To be honest, any opening that starts with a d pawn up. So these two pawns sitting next to each other, they're also known as hanging pawns. Now, sometimes hanging pawns are considered a weakness. They don't do much, probably, and they're not easily defended. But when you have two of them, c4 and d4, it could be an advantage or a disadvantage. So for here, white has a few strategies with his isolated pawn couple, his hanging pawns. Black also has a few strategies, and depending on how well each player plays, this could be an advantage to either player. So for white, he has a few strategies. He has about 3 strategies that I can think of. So here, white could use the e5 square as a home for one of his knights. So basically, we just move this pawn up. Well, first, so there was a knight on f3, then we moved to e5 basically, and then we moved this pawn up. And notice that now this knight here on e5 is really powerful. It's controlling so many squares on the black territory, and black can't really do many things, many moves. Some of his moves are a bit restricted now, and just it's getting tighter. His space not that spatial anymore. For white, this really helps him with a huge spatial plus, and also really good chances for a kingside attack. Notice that this square is also really felt well defended by, I think, 4 pieces for white. And with this knight here, it kind of traps off the other pieces, the king, the queen, the knight, the rook, the bishop. They cut those black pieces off from the black king, kind of. This knight acts as a little barrier, so that way that black queen or anything else might need some maneuvering to get to the black king. Meanwhile, white, because of the closed position, can easily push these pawns up and disrupt the black king side, and then launch his pieces over to the black king side, or maybe you don't want to do a pawn push. Maybe you just want to go straight to a kingside attack, maneuvering this knight somewhere, and then maneuvering this queen. Also getting this bishop on b2 a bit active. Actually, it's pretty active right now, and possibly opening up the kingside push. The kingside space. You need something to disrupt those pawns right there. So yeah, when white has those hanging pawns on c4 and d4, you could really use them as a nice spatial advantage at adding on to your space as white by moving this knight up. And notice that these pawns c4 and d4, they really they protect a lot of space in front of them from b5 to e5, and those two squares in between. So it's really good for white if you play it like this. Now, white can also make a really strong push. So again, white has pawns on c4 and d4. They're hanging pawns, isolated, and you can make a really strong pass pawn by c4 to wrong piece. With c4 to c5 or d4 to d5, and then both so both of these advances will also activate white's pieces. For example, if we did let's say d5, this really opens up that bishop, that white bishop on b2. So let's say, I don't know, black wants to take back. So first notice that this bishop, now there was a pawn on d4 blocking this bishop's range. Now all there is two knight blocking, which could easily be moved. And also these rooks have one less pawn in their way. This bishop also could be really good, really helpful, and just everything is a bit easier for white to maneuver his pieces. And going back to that first topic, when white takes on d5, he could easily just run this pawn down the board and use his pass pawn to try to promote, or at the very least disrupt the black pieces. And once this takes, that bishop on b3 will be able to have more range. This knight also will have more range. And let's say white would take, then that knight on c3 can move over, and these rooks have open files, and it's just really good for white with this pass pawn. So just to demonstrate this, take right here, and then now black is in a pretty tight position. Also because this knight on e5 is also really annoying, and also adding pressure to the black pieces. Now the third way that white could use his hanging pawns on c4 and d4 is by creating a weakness in the enemy camp with a pawn push. So in the previous boards, you might have realized that this pawn was on a2, now it's on a4, just to make things a bit more convenient. So remember how we talked about white moving his knight up to e5 to help with a kingside push, probably disrupt and get the black king. Now we could also do the same thing with a queenside push, except this time we're not using a knight, we're using a pawn. And once we move this pawn up, now it adds a bit more pressure to the black army. Let's say black doesn't take this pawn, then white can move his pawn on a5 up to a6 and be a bit annoying to the black bishop, though it might be a bit risky to make that pawn push. if black takes, then notice that white now has open files for this rook. Can easily take with this bishop. Sometimes you might not have this bishop on this square. Maybe it might be on b2. Then you can't take the pawn, but you still have a lot of great opportunities. Black has a double pawn on the a file, which could easily be disruptive, and this pawn is passed. You have passed pawn on the c file. There's no enemy pawns obstructing its path, and also so these pawns c4 and d4 could easily just run down the board and be a bit annoying to black. So those were strategies for white. Now we have a few strategies for black. So because black is, you could say he's defending against these pawns, but sometimes you don't want to think that you're defending. Maybe you're attacking the pawns. So as black, or as a defender, you always want to try to look for a counterattack. So in this, black is trying to attack this pawns on c4 and d4. Let's say white wasn't able to execute what we previously said. So now black, he needs to try to pressure white's pawns before white can utilize them further. And if he can't make them a weakness for white, as we've shown, black might not be able to have a lot of space and hence not a lot of breathing room. So first, black could bring his pieces to attack the white pawns. Notice that we had this knight somewhere here or here. We had a knight somewhere, but it was not on a5. And we also had a bishop that was probably not on a6. I think it was on b7 on previous boards. But let's say black brought up his knight to a5 and a bishop to a6. Now he's placing pressure on that pawn on c4, and white has to place a bit more defenses on that pawn. Right now, white has 1, 2, 3, 4 defenders on that c4 pawn. Black has also 4 defenders, so it might not be sufficient yet to attack that pawn, but placing pressure on the pawn nevertheless keeps white on his toes, and he can't really use those pawns anymore. So it's in a way helpful. So black, he can also play to disrupt these powerful pawns by trying to break them apart. So remember how we wanted these pawns together because they took up a lot of space for white. They were pretty nice at marking the white territory. They guard the squares on b5, c5, d5, and e5, and they provide more space for white pieces to go to and pretty much be safe. Now black, he doesn't want white to continue with this advantage. He wants to take away those pawns so that way white can never have any of those advantages. So we can play to create some holes in this structure with a pawn push on b6 to b5, and when we push up, we could also do this for e6 to e5, and we can easily just break up this pawn structure. So white can then trade pawns off, and so let's say we did a b6 to b5 push, and now white can trade the pawns off, which will lead to an isolated pawn on d4, and that's just not going to be that strong. And white can also push the C pawn, and now you got a pass pawn. The only problem with this is that this can easily be blocked. And now if you push this pawn up, you have the D pawn, which is a backward pawn, which is kind of weak. That's all you gotta know about backward pawn. The D pawn is now back in the back of the C pawn, and it's just not that strong. So that's the problem with that. And going back to making the holes, so in this diagram, white gotta choose between C takes B5, and A takes B5 for black. Black takes back, and it leaves him with the isolated pawn. And pushing C5 up will leave the D5 square in black's hands, and it's just a safe square for that knight on F6 to hop to F6 and D5, and easily white does not have a lot of space. So let's say black pushed with the other pawn, E6 to E5. Now white has to choose between D takes E5, and then this knight takes back on E5. But it doesn't look that safe, because now black got a nice active knight on E5, easily taking up a lot of space. And pushing up to D5 also creates a weak square on C5 and a weak pawn on C4, which the knight on D7 can easily hop to C5 and again take more space for black to use. And also the C4 pawn will be backwards, and it's just not that strong. So I guess that will be pretty much it for today's video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. And if you guys did, leave a like, subscribe, and click that notifications bell to see more chess videos.